back. Hi. How was lunch? Yeah, kind of not. Is it okay? Lobster? Nice. Sarah, you're supposed to be setting a good example. So I think we have a really good afternoon planned here. The official government bureaucrat for GitHub is here and has brought us the official seal of the OctoCat, which hopefully you will help explain in a little while. The afternoon is about converting pre-existing closed development communities to open. And we have a series of very good speakers followed by a discussion around what the National Cancer Institute is doing with just that. So to start us off, Ben Balter from GitHub.
Sweet. So we all got back from lunch. Everyone just ate. Everyone's tired, and we get to talk about thrilling open source licensing. Who's excited? I know, right? Exactly. So I'm Ben Balter. I'm with GitHub. I'm kind of their government liaison, government evangelist, and yeah, talk about open source licensing. I've been involved with open source for as long as I can remember, and been involved with the government for the past 3 years or so before moving over to GitHub. So if you are going to fall asleep, the quick TLDR: I'm not a lawyer. I'm taking the bar next month, so I'm as close as you can be to be a lawyer without actually being a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer, so make sure to talk to your general counsel's office before you actually go ahead and actually just don't listen. But if you do happen to listen, talk to your lawyer first. The TLDR is just slap the MIT license on it and call it a day, and don't think too hard about it. You have better things to do with your time. And the only exception to that is if you're building like a Drupal module or WordPress plugin, which is GPL derived. If you understood all that, then go take an extended lunch because you're doing great. So the roadmap. Talk about copyright. So before we can talk about licensing, we have to talk about copyright, the little thing at the bottom of most websites. What licensing is, what licensing means in the government context, then finally why we're here, what licensing means in the context of growing a community. So copyright. Copyright, everyone probably knows what copyright is kind of intuitively. It's a little thing at the bottom of the page. It says, if I made this, I have the right to do it. Legally speaking, copyright is 6 exclusive rights that is granted to you by the government. Here I kind of simplified it down to 4. The right to reproduce it, the right to prepare derivative work, meaning take it and make something else out of it, the right to distribute copies, and the right to perform that or display that publicly in the software context. It used to be that you needed to put a little copyright notice at the bottom of every page, put it in a book, anything like that. Since about 1979 or so, there was an international treaty signed called the Berne Convention, which means that the United States is, as soon as you reduce something to a tangible form, and you put it in a medium that's physical outside your brain in the real world, all of a sudden you have copyright in that. You don't have to do anything more. If you want to get super technical, you have to register it with the Library of Congress before you can litigate it, but for all intents and purposes, all you have to do is just make it. And when we talk about what can you actually copyright, we're here to talk about software licensing. So you can obviously copyright software, but you can't copyright the idea of software. I can't hold the copyright in the generic idea of what a content management system is. I can't hold the copyright in the generic idea of an operating system, but I can hold the copyright in Apple, in OS X, in Drupal, in WordPress. So how does copyright come out in the software context? This is just a screenshot from the About My Mac page inside OS X. Besides for showing off how cool my computer is, it tells you, if you look at the bottom there, it says copyright 1983 to 2013, Apple Incorporated. So oftentimes when we think about copyright in these software contexts, it's as a defensive mechanism. It's making sure that even if I can somehow get a hold of the source code behind OS X, behind Apple's operating system, or behind Microsoft Windows, I don't have the right to redistribute that. I don't have the right to adapt that or modify that. And then you can also see it exactly right next to that. It says license agreement. It's a link, obviously. It's telling me that even the context of proprietary software, which is where we normally talk about copyright and licensing, even in that context, the rights are held within Microsoft, are held within Apple, and I'm given a license. In this case, the license to actually just use the software. So what is licensing? Think about licensing as breaking up the rights of ownership versus the rights of use. A great analogy that I like to use to explain this is if you rent an apartment building. If you rent an apartment building or rent a unit in an apartment building, you obviously know that you do not own that unit. You have an exclusive right to stay in that unit, to occupy that unit for the term of your lease, but you can't go and turn around and sell that part of the building to somebody else. The rights, the ownership of that unit is retained within your landlord, and he licenses to you the right to use that. In terms of software context, those questions are A, what can and can't I do with your code? right? So if you just throw it up on the internet, can I look at your code? Can I use your code? If you throw it up on GitHub, can I fork your code and propose some changes to it? And the second part of that license is if I choose to contribute to your open source project, what happens to my rights? I'm obviously giving up some rights because it's no longer my exclusive right to use and see and know about that code as soon as I hand it to you, but what exactly are those rights that I'm giving up? So software licensing. Software licensing is just kind of a proxy, a shorthand to simplify this transaction that happens millions upon millions of times a day. Geeks have been trying to license software since as long as open source has existed, and so there's kind of just certain kind of brands of software licensing that geeks can use as a shorthand, so they don't have to go through the process of negotiating individual license agreements each time. So generally what a license agreement is going to do is going to tell you that if something goes wrong, don't sue. I will tell you what rights I'm granting, but also if something goes wrong, don't sue me. This software is provided as is, and that often they'll say that, hey, if you give this software to somebody else, just make sure to include this copyright notice in there. Pay it forward. Give me credit and include this kind of who made what, where, when kind of stuff. Technically, there's no reason that you can't go out and make your own software license and call it the government license, the Ben Balter license, the NASA license, to pick a crazy example. Just don't do that. It's the geeks will not like it. The whole point of the software license is to simplify the transaction and lower the friction of having a geek, having a developer contribute to their project. And if I have to start going through and I'm seeing fancy legal terms that I don't know, lawyers need to get involved, there's not prior art on it, it just gets bad. So don't do that. So licenses. What are the actual licenses? What are these short form proxies that we use to describe rights? Kind of the most common in the first class of license that I group together are the MIT, the BSD, and the Apache license. The names are kind of arbitrary. They have to do with who originally created the license. It doesn't mean that only MIT uses the MIT license. I'd argue that's one of the more popular licenses right now, along with BSD and Apache. This group of licenses basically grant explicitly grant unlimited rights. So here up there, if you can read it, that's the full text of the MIT license, the entire MIT license with the three components. What rights do you grant me if I use if you contribute to my software? Make sure you include this copyright notice, and whatever you do, don't sue me. That's the entire MIT license. So that's actually very comfortable for government to use in many contexts, because all it's doing is not saying you can't do this. It's saying, by the way, just to make it clear, here's everything you can do. And in the MIT license, it says do anything you want, basically, as you can see there, without limitation. The other kind of class of licenses are called copyleft, or the GPL is the most common example of this, viral licensing. What a viral license says is anytime you have a project, so WordPress, Drupal, Linux are all examples of viral GPL licensed software. Anytime you have a viral work, if I were to create a derivative work of that, I need to license that project under the same terms, or compatible terms to be technical, if I'm going to redistribute that. So to put that in practical sense, I used to be a WordPress developer. I made WordPress plugins. Some of them I made for the federal government, some of them I made personally. Because WordPress is a GPL licensed, copyleft, viral project, any plugin which hooks into the WordPress API and therefore would be a derivative work needs to also be licensed under the GPL. I had no choice in that. Theoretically, there's some even more restrictive license you can do, but in legal terms, we talk about rights and IP rights and property rights as having a bundle of sticks, right? So the original creator of the software will have this big bundle of sticks, and then I, as a user of that software, as a downstream person that grabs the WordPress code, only get some of those sticks, and within those sticks isn't the right to add more sticks. There's a finite amount of sticks. So if it starts with 10 and I get 5 sticks, I can't then bump that back up to 7. The most I can possibly give is 5, which the GPL requires you have to do. That goes for both forks and plugins. So if I take WordPress and I make a patch of WordPress or Drupal or any GPL licensed product, it applies to that. It also applies to plugins and modules and things that kind of are complementary goods of the original thing. There's some nuance in GPL. I generally, for noobs, as they say on the internet, try to avoid GPL because it can get kind of complicated in terms of compatibility, and there's a whole big holy war around it. But just know that there are several different versions, V2, V3, and then this kind of pseudo version called V2 or V3 or later, which means any subsequent version. The big difference between V2 and V3 has to do with TiVoization and has to do with software being hosted on third-party services and crazy stuff that probably will not come up in most contexts, but just know that it's out there. And these kind of requirements that something be licensed only kick into effect if you distribute the software. So if I'm a government agency and I take Drupal, like whitehouse.gov did, and I make a Drupal module to extend the functionality of Drupal, of whitehouse.gov, as long as I don't distribute that plugin, meaning as long as it stays within my organization, that's fine. The requirements of the distribution requirements are not triggered. It's not like it has to be open source. It's that if I do open source it, it has to be GPL. The last kind of thing in this category to be aware of is dual licensing. Like I said, because the GPL can provide some sort of conflicts and can make certain software incompatibilities, some software projects, specifically libraries, will dual license software. So how many are familiar with jQuery, at least heard of what jQuery is? They've seen the error messages when things break because of bad jQuery. jQuery is a dual license project. It's both GPL and either MIT or Apache. So that way jQuery can easily be embedded within Drupal and embedded within WordPress and other GPL licensed software. But if I don't want to use the GPL license, I can grab it under MIT or Apache and use it elsewhere without that copyleft restriction. It's not like I have to fill out a form and select a drop-down and download a different version. All that means is that I'm using it under a certain context. There's no further action necessary. So it's easier to incorporate in other projects. So open source in demand. How does all this play into the government space? In short, the government is very, very much structured in favor of open source, even though kind of in popular parlance we might not think that, but legally it actually is. There's three ways, if you break it down, that open source can come about. It could be contractor-created code, it can be government-related code, or it can be contributor-created code, community-created code. That's how you can get code into an open source project. In terms of contractor-created code, generally speaking, a contracting officer needs to waive away the government's interest in the software in order for the contractor to maintain complete control over it. Most boilerplate contracts, because contracting officers aren't very well aware of a lot of the stuff. Some are great, some just, this is new to them, this is a new field in some senses. We'll just wave it away because they just copy and paste out of an old contract. Technically speaking, a contractor has to mark the software ahead of time, has to give you a list of all the things that they're claiming rights under. There's a bunch of legal citations if you're into that kind of stuff. But the pro tip here is A, be aware of it at the time of contracting. Make sure that either it's a deliverable within the contract, the contractor has to open up his software at the end, so the last step in the chain of the deliverables, deliverable 5.2 or whatever it is, throw the software up on GitHub, or make sure that that's clear with your contracting officer that you want to make sure that the government maintains what's called unlimited rights, or at least if it's negotiated, 16 negotiated contract, that you at least get government purpose rights with the right to publish it, so you can open source it and have the option to if you want to. Government-created code is even easier. Anything that's made by a government employee on government time within the scope of government employment is not subject to domestic copyright protection under 17 U.S.C. 105, the Copyright Act. What that means is that if I'm a government employee and I make code, some of the licensing stuff gets a little bit more complicated, but that doesn't mean you can't license it. At the very minimum, it just means you put it out in the public domain, but you can also do other little tricks. One thing I used to love to do is, so if it's viral derivative work, if it's a WordPress plugin, my hands are tied. Again, I don't have the 10 rights, I only have the 5, so I have to release it under the GPL. So one trick would be just to include one line of GPL code someplace in the project, and all of a sudden when you go to the lawyer, be like, general counsel, be like, it has to be GPL. We can't release it under public domain. It's a derivative work. So there's little loopholes here and there. The last is community contributed code. Lots of general counsel's offices, when kind of open source as a contribution model, started getting involved, started getting a little bit scared, and for a good reason. The APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, prevents accepting donated services from professional services from third parties. You have gift authority issues. It can be kind of complicated. The framework that's really come about is post the project someplace publicly. I like GitHub. You can post it any place you want. Require within the README and the documentation that the project, any contribution to the project, be licensed under the same terms of the project itself. Individual contributors retain their copyright. Remember, there's a distinction between copyright and license. So if I'm a contributor, I retain the copyright to my code. I then license it to the world under the MIT, under Apache, under GPL. And just like the government could grab any other open source project off the internet, they grab my code off the internet just like any other person on this planet, and they can then bring that into their project. So government is just using publicly posted code. The last thing to talk about is community building. We want to use licensing to build communities. The underlying thread here is that licensing simplifies and minimizes the friction of me as a developer to get involved in a software project. So A, make sure to always license the project. Lots of government agencies say, oh, well, we have to put it under public domain. It needs to be public domain. That's going to push a lot of developers away. As a developer, I don't want to just give away and do my work for free. I'm a professional. Right, I get paid to do this most of the time. If I want to volunteer some time to the government, I at least want to be able to make sure I get credit, maybe make sure it's not used by a competitor or something like that. Use a familiar license. MIT is the simplest, it's the cleanest, most people know it, they're all very good. But all you're really doing there is minimizing ambiguity, showing the developer community that you speak their language. So use a familiar license, spell things out in the project README, right? All too often I have buddies that will go to a project and be like, yeah, I kind of want to contribute, but like, does that mean that they're going to audit me if I contribute? Like, the government's a scary place. Like, does the NSA have access to this code? Like, what's going on here? So just spell out the exact transaction that's going to be occurring in the README. The great way to do that, the traditional way to do that is license.txt to actually include the full text of the license. In the README, say, hey, if you contribute, you're contributing under these terms. And the great thing on GitHub, if you include a file called contributing.markdown, then when I go to submit a pull request, when I go to open an issue, there's a giant thing at the top that says, hey, if you're contributing under these terms. Click here to make sure you see them. And that satisfies most lawyers in terms of notice requirements, that they actually know what they're giving away. Last, never, if you want to build a community, if you don't care about your community, go ahead. But if you do want to build a community, never require a contributor license agreement. Contributor license agreement just says, hey, you have to like print this out, sign it in ink, and fax this back to me so that I'm actually getting that copyright. I can think of no better way to raise the barrier to contribution than to force a geek to like use a fax machine. It's just, I don't even understand that. So the last thing I want to close out with is kind of just common naysayer FUD that I've heard from open sourcing projects within government. And if you followed me so far, great. This is kind of like the bonus round, the 201 kind of class of some of the edge cases that might come up. So theoretically, if I'm a government agency and I commit code, the first commit can technically be public domain, right? If it's government-created code created solely by government employees, that first commit can technically be public domain because it's not subject to copyright protection. Theoretically, and then also it's a great project, we got a great community going, other contributions have come in from the public, from contractors, from various different sources. At that point, the project as a whole could then be licensed under MIT, under GPL, or something like that. But theoretically, if I can go back in time and see the initial commit, that could still theoretically be public domain with none of the other contributions. And also, if I can get an individual line of code, if there's a line of code that adds one in one and is independent from the other part of the software, I could theoretically, as a developer, pull that one line of code out and use that under public domain. But this is just super edge case, and the dirty secret about software licensing is, especially in the open source side of things, it's never litigated. We're all geeks. We're giving our software away for free, right? So maybe I don't get it under the proper permission I want. Usually that's resolved through non-legal means. So you don't have to go super crazy about this stuff. And the last kind of bit is that if it's licensed internationally, so if the Queen of England wants to use your GPL software, it's better that it's under GPL rather than get like the State Department involved and then pull requests take years. And I've seen the bureaucracy; it's not good. So just make sure to license your code. And at the end of the day, the benefit outweighs the harm. I'd much rather say, yeah, it's kind of a legal gray area, but it's an extremely low risk that's never been litigated, and it's much more important to encourage contributors than it is to make sure to follow the black letter line of the law to the T. So that's kind of like software licensing in a super quick nutshell. Everything here is online at github.com/Ben Balter, and I'll be around here for the rest of the day. I'm glad to answer questions and have some additional resources I can throw your way. But I'm not a lawyer. MIT licensed it, and I forgot what the third one was. If it's GPL derived work, just be careful of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Mike, if you want to get hooked up. I want to thank, I guess, at least Nate, who seems to be taking remarkably good notes on all of this, and encourage anyone to kind of follow along, because sometimes what's important to one person is not important to others, so it's good to capture all those things. Mike Pulsifer is the lead IT specialist at Department of Labor, and is going to talk to us about how to move a closed development community to open.
If you'll just bear with me a second here. Got the screens all mixed up. There we go. All right, thanks. So, as you mentioned, my name is Mike Pulsifer. I'm from Department of Labor. I'm in the Office of Public Affairs. My responsibility there is in charge of the web application mobile development, and within the last couple of years, also the public API and the developer portal. And what I'm going to do is just go briefly through a little bit of a history of how we got to where we are, a little bit about why, some of the what I consider cultural issues that we had to address, and then talk about the various tools and resources that we're making available to try to open up and continually open up the development community that we support. So briefly, why did we open it? Well, I'm sure many of us have a good idea why, but the first thing that really comes to mind for us is we have to do more with less nowadays. If it isn't the sequester, if it was the years leading up to that where budgets were flat or sometimes even decreasing. And even within our shop, we're doing all that mobile application development. We're keeping the lights on, web application development, maintaining the API, publishing data, all this, 3 developers. We can really only do so much, especially if we want to keep pushing things forward. So we also don't have all the expertise. I mean, just look at this room here. Outside of the department, there's so many really smart people, with great ideas. What better way to further the mission of our department than to get the community developing great solutions that further our mission. Now, looking at the developer community that we had set up before, and this is even just as recent as a year ago, we were looking like something like this. Is this really a community where we're just preaching down, as the government, down to the developers who are looking to use our resources? Earlier this morning, one of the community types that was brought up was the walled garden. Well, this is a walled garden with extra high walls. We took the approach that, here's some software development kits, some code you can use, but we're going to control everything. You can get it as a zip file, and that's about it. Well, things are obviously a lot different now, because what we really needed is a community that acted more like this, where it wasn't just a communication between the government and the individual developers, but also wanted to facilitate communication between the developers so that they can help each other as they're using our resources as well. Again, not just multiplying the amount of developers, if you will, but also multiplying the support staff, if you will. So just briefly, cultural issues as I see them. I'm sure many of us have seen some of these. And the first I'm going to address is the attitude. Of course, we have people in government who've been there for a long time, and open source, this is new, it's scary. And I actually had this said to me a few weeks ago. What's to stop you from getting paid by the Chinese to approve an insecure pull request? Of course, I could have gotten all passive-aggressive and asked, well, what's to stop you from getting paid by them too? But as long as you've got your policies and processes in place, this really shouldn't be, shouldn't be much of an issue. Another is, if we don't control the answers, it's a security threat. Or if we don't control the code, again, it's about if you're having the appropriate policies and procedures in place. And answers to the public must be vetted for accuracy. You hear this from the bureaucrats quite a bit, at least in the past, a little bit less so now. But as long as we're not talking about policy, and generally we're not, what we're talking about here are more technical in nature, that's less of an issue. Now, legal questions, just a couple here. Again, the same statement. We heard it from the solicitors years ago. Things are a lot different now. Again, one of the things that they've even agreed with us is, if we're not talking policy, it's really not that much of an issue. And Ben talked about this. This was suggested earlier this morning as well. We need to make sure that our contract permits, in our case we're using contractors, we need to make sure it permits us to use code under an unrestricted or less restrictive license. Based on advice from our solicitors, we decided to release everything in the public domain, even that code that was written by our contractors. How can we do that? Well, they directed us to this particular section in the FAR and made sure that we had that in. Yeah, you had it on your slide too, yes. And of course, I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be one, so consult with your legal and procurement offices. But the reason why we went this route, in addition to advice from our solicitors, is that, my vision a year ago when we started down this path was to not just put a couple projects up on GitHub and call it a day, but I really wanted to take a more long-term, even strategic look at things, and so that anytime we're creating software, anytime we're building applications, we sit back and ask ourselves, can this be of a benefit to the taxpayers who paid for this? Can this be a benefit to even us if we open source it and hopefully get some contributions back? So look at the tools and the resources that we're sharing. The first things we put out there were our SDKs for the API. Now, a year ago, those SDKs worked only with our API. Now they work with dozens of federal APIs out there. They're available on GitHub, so and we've tested them against at least 24. If you have an API that isn't in the list in that repository, by all means, test it. If you need to, if it needs a little work, by all means, we'd love to get some pull requests on that. And the whole idea there is, granted, we may be fairly experienced developers, but I want to make sure that even the most junior, most novice developer, even somebody who just had a great idea that weekend and wanted to build an app, can get at government data. Now, in addition to that, we've also open sourced all of our mobile apps. And a great story here is that I went to the owner of the Wage and Hour timesheet app. He's been wanting for a long time to add some improvements, even get an Android version out there. But we've lacked the necessary resources, be it people or money. And he saw this as a great opportunity to get the code out there, and if someone could run with it, even if they produce a derivative work and released and did not contribute back, but created a product based on it that the public can get some value out of, that supports our mission as well. So it would be a win-win regardless. In addition to the SDKs, we released the code for our sample apps and their documentation. So we're actually using the GitHub Pages feature so that the public can, or any developer out there, if they want to contribute or make improvements to not even the sample app, but also the documentation, they can. This is a bit of a leap for us culturally because it's so easy to want to control it totally. But this is definitely an opportunity for us to possibly even put more content out there in an open source manner. Now, as far as our API is concerned, we set up a repository that just has a README, but we're using some features within GitHub, specifically the issues page here, to help us crowdsource support for our API. So rather than just relying on our webmaster email address, again, it's allowing the developers to help each other. And then one thing we have coming up, it's due to be released starting next Friday, is we're going to take transparency, if you will, to yet another degree. We have usage metrics that where I can see how the API is being used, what apps are using the data, and what data they're requesting. We're making that data available to the developers themselves, see how their apps are being used starting next Friday. We'll be rolling out this data in form of data sets, and then eventually be building a dashboard on top of that. And I can't close out without mentioning GSA's mobile code catalog. This is hosted up on GitHub. So anybody can fork it and submit pull requests, as Ben has done several times. And but basically, what it is it's a resource for agencies to help them get started, or even save time in their development process as they're building mobile apps, whether they're mobile web apps or native apps. And there's additional resources as well, like, for example, test scripts. So by all means, if you're a mobile developer, please check this out. If you want to get in touch with me, managedeveloper.dol.gov, but my email address is up there, and that's my personal Twitter account. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Yep, need to switch back. We already got you up. Next up, we have Joseph Porcelli from Gov Delivery and GovLoop. What's your official title?
Director of Engagement Services.
Director of Engagement Services. Doesn't that sound like fun? Talking about how to grow users into community members. So let me get you switched over here, and you're going to want this, yes?
Sure. Sounds
You can do
good.
Cartwheels and stuff.
Yeah, I had said I was going to do cartwheels and handsprings and all kinds of stuff, but I don't feel like it anymore. So while he's doing that, I used to live a couple blocks down the street from this building, and my friends who know me well refer to me as a professional neighbor, and you'll learn a little bit more about that in my presentation. But I have a bit of an online community building problem. And one of the examples of that is this building, while it was under construction, along with all the other buildings that are under construction in the area, have tower cranes. And I moved to DC a couple years ago, 2 years ago, and I didn't know anybody, so all I saw were tower cranes all the time. So I got really interested in tower cranes. So I have a community about tower cranes. So if any of you also find them fascinating the way I do, you can go to facebook.com/tower cranes and check them out. And there's 180 different tower crane operators that answer any question I ask about tower cranes. So feel free to join that community, okay? Okay. Where's the clicker, or am I going to just press the button here? Yeah, just the button. Okay. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of information about my background, which will paint some of the picture and explain kind of the approach I'll be talking about today. And I'm not really coming from a coder community background, but I wanted to share some of the insights I've learned in all the communities I've been organizing nonstop for the last 10 years, because I think it's going to share some insights. And what I'm hoping I'll be able to do is kind of frame an approach, so as we approach the sessions this afternoon, it might open up something for you. So there's a couple insights and takeaways that I'm going to go through here. And the first is be clear about what you want. And invite other people to take action with you. Don't ever try to do it alone. Ask the community, because the community has the answers. I see really successful community managers and leaders facilitating what other people are doing and kind of bringing it out of them. And then I'm going to share something with you that we call the engagement formula, and then 5 basic tips, because it's hard to kind of retain a lot in a short period of time. And then I'm going to try something new that I'm calling the perimeter of engagement. And it's a little exercise I'm going to walk you through that'll hopefully help again later today. And then a reminder is to track engagement activities towards your business outcomes. Because it's great that we're doing all this work, but I find that lots of clients we work with, it's easy to kind of lose track of that, and you always have to come back and measure against it. So here we go. So my background. I started organizing in my neighborhood in Boston in 2004 because of some crime that was happening. Turned out that bringing neighbors together, drinking beer, and calling the police when it wasn't your neighbor crawling through their window worked. And so I got recruited to work for Boston Police, doing work in the neighborhood watch unit, and then joined Service Nation after some successful work there in online community building, and then wound up as the first community engagement strategist for Homeland Security, and then joined Gov Delivery and GovLoop, and I now run the consulting practice for both the companies. And in my free time, at the same time here, I'm the founder of neighborsforneighbors.org, which was the first social network for a city in Boston where neighbors, police officers, and civil servants communicated and collaborated to improve quality of life. And we were really early out of the gate, so early that people thought it was a really dumb idea. And now you just may have heard like a week or two ago, Nextdoor just did a huge partnership with the city of New York, so we're proud to have pioneered and done some of the early work for organizations that actually had funding, because by the way, I've had no funding for anything on the bottom, but been very successful with it. So in 2007, I was bored and decided to wear a name tag every day for a year because I wanted to encourage people to know their neighbors. 19,000 people joined me for a day. It was pretty cool, and I have a cool picture to show you about that. I also thought it'd be cool to reduce waste by promoting mugs, and you'll see a slide about that, so I'll share the impact in a second. And then my newest thing, which I haven't had too much time to spend on yet, but I think is really cool, and I'm hoping maybe you'll help me, is called Neighbor Depot, and you'll learn about that as well. Okay, so The first thing I started doing is hosting these neighborhood socials in my neighborhood in Boston. So it's really easy. Flyer, like 1,000 flyers, invite people to a bar to have a beer, meet their neighbors, people will start talking and cool stuff will happen from it. The lesson here is I saw people getting mugged in my neighborhood, and it was really bad, and I wanted to make them safer, so I took action and I asked people to help me. Key takeaway, take action, ask people to help you. At Boston Police, I was able to get more people to volunteer to start neighborhood watch groups, but I could only go to, I think 2007 I made to 257 night meetings. I couldn't go to any more. So I had to remove myself as the bottleneck and use technology. This was Ning. This is the first Ning network I built, but essentially it connected neighbors to each other and police officers so that they could collaborate. Now, I don't know code and I didn't have the resources that many of you had, but the idea was to bring people together so they can do it and execute on the vision that I believed in, if that makes sense. Okay, so with my name tag project, I had this idea that I could talk to the commissioner of Boston Police. You've seen him on TV recently, right? I had this idea, I'm like, what if we had everybody wear a name tag at Fenway Park for a day during a game to get to know each other to make a point? So we used this example, and we had, I think, 10,000 people that day wear a name tag during the game, which was a really fun thing. It was a big public event, and that started a whole bunch of other conversations, which led to a whole bunch of more action. The point here is, you can do things online, but whenever possible, do things offline together so people have a real visceral experience which will inspire them to further action. So my friend Dan and I, this was my partner on the Mug project, we decided that a good way to get the word out would be to make a really stupid video and post it online. So this is Dan in bed. I was Mugla, the mug, and Mugla arrived back in the bedroom to find Dan in bed with a bunch of disposable cups. Heart was broken. This video didn't quite go viral, but what happened is Starbucks caught on to this, and we had some people talk to them. 3 months later, they were selling mugs in every Starbucks at point of purchase. So it influenced some of their behavior, which was cool, and we had some other people do stuff online, but it wasn't that important, but we just made a video and built a community and a campaign around it. So fast forward to present day, with Neighbors for Neighbors, which is our social network in Boston. There's a community of about 3,000 people, and in Boston it snows a lot every year. And every time it snows, if you're sick, elderly, or disabled, you get stuck. You can't go to the pharmacy, you can't get out to go to the doctor's office, and you can't get food. So I had this idea. I thought, after hearing Cory Booker's awesome story about tweeting and go shoveling someone out, I was curious, what if I could help other people go shovel each other out and allow them to request help and get notified? So I reached out to my friends at SeeClickFix, and that's actually SeeClickFix. They created a custom code or neighbor request instead of going into city 311 systems so that people can do this. And for the last 3 years, people have been digging each other out in Boston. And I just do a little bit of work, and I run it from DC without even picking up a shovel. So just an idea here of what you can do to get other people to serve each other. During the Boston Marathon bombing that recently happened, one of my concerns was what is going to happen to all the people who are staying in the hotels that were all locked down. So again, we used SeeClickFix in our community and wound up getting something like 900 people to register to host people who might have needed housing. We had a big email list, big community, threw something up that was live in 3 hours. No one used it, but it was a good idea. Just show an example of some of the kind of things you can do. And the takeaway here is there's place, there's time, there's relevance, and there's people's availability and willingness to help each other. If you can the more of those things you can stack up on each other, the faster and the more powerful stuff can happen. Okay, so come to present day here. One of the big projects that we work on is actually the National Preparedness Community for FEMA. It's community.fema.gov, and here there's over 26,000 people who are working together to learn how to prepare and actually hosting preparedness activities. And in 2012, they engaged over 1.5 million Americans in learning how to do preparedness activities. I think this is a really awesome example of a government agency using collaborative technologies to have the citizens act on their behalf, to co-create, to co-organize, and execute on their mission. And I think that's a huge spot for everyone to look, and I think it's just starting to happen in the government space. But since there's so much money falling out of the sky, don't pay attention to anything I'm saying, because it won't be necessary. Okay. Another example of this, and this is actually both of these are on the GovDelivery collaboration platform, so they look a little similar here, but NIST MEP uses this to empower their entire MEP community around sharing best practices, building efficiencies, and increasing the effectiveness of their operation to create job growth and economic growth. So another example of that. MEP is Manufacturing Extension Partnerships. Thank you. Okay, so this is Carolyn Madison, my new friend. Carolyn was, I'm coming into the insight section here of the presentation. Carolyn and I became friends because I learned that when people call to get help when they want to be shoveled out, there's a couple things that happen. First thing is they're really relieved, like this is awesome. And then they get really anxious because they're like, I'm going to get some help, but what if I don't get help? What if I don't get to the doctor? So we began talking, and I started calling all the folks that were who were asking for help. And over time, we got to know each other a little more. And one day she said to me, she goes, Joseph, I realized if I actually knew my neighbors, I wouldn't need your help. And it was from listening to her and investing in the one-on-one personal conversation where I learned from her that I was actually not solving a problem, I was addressing a symptom. So that's what led to NeighborDepot.com, which is a new project I'm working on, where she and I are co-authoring, and we invite you if you're interested. It's called The Elder's Guide Towards Getting to Know and Getting Help from Your Neighbors. So we're going to kind of step outside of the technology realm and really just help people be more empowered to take actions that will make them less dependent on the service. So the insight came from the community, and the action and the activity will come out of what we'll build together, and we'll be looking to address that. Another example here, when I was working for Homeland Security, this was a network that's no longer live. It's called Our Border. And when I got here, it was a very public kind of message, typical kind of like, here's some information, here's what you do. And there was this giant raving argument about comprehensive immigration reform on the community. It was nasty, it was ugly, it was totally unproductive. And one of my first challenges was to shut this conversation, or not shut the conversation down, but transform it into something that could be productive. And I had no idea how to go about it. So the first thing I did as the community manager here is I said, what do you guys think about what's happening? And most people, no matter what their position, said, this is unproductive. So I said, I heard you think it's unproductive. Do you all agree? Yes. How do you think we can go about making it more productive without taking sides on anything? And the community had like debates for weeks on what that would look like. And they agreed to kind of break it down into smaller pieces. And then they began listening. It became constructive. And it took what was a whole bunch of anger into something that was more productive and made the network more cordial to working on the things that they actually wanted to work on. So again, it came out of the community, and I trusted them, and I asked them for advice. And it was successful in bringing that conversation to a close. Let's see here. So another example of listening to the community, and you'll see this if you're already a member of the FEMA community or not. We asked last year, so this was our kind of first year out of the bat, really building this for year-round engagement. What would you like us to do different that would be really helpful? And we just put that question out, and we learned a couple key things from them. They wanted to learn how to prepare. They wanted to learn how to help others prepare. They wanted to connect with people who are like them, and they wanted to meet other FEMA and DHS personnel that can actually get them information or help them do what they're doing. So in a couple weeks, we'll be rolling this out where there'll be communities of practice, and there'll be more participation from other offices within FEMA. So we are going to tell them we heard them, and we're going to tell them the action we did and ask them to give us feedback. So we're trusting them, we're responding to them, and we're saying, we're not sure if we got it right, but we're making progress. Continue to guide us, because this is really important. So how am I doing on timing? Am I going over here? A little over? Let me just see what else I got. I'm going to skip this and skip this. I'm going to go to this slide here. So the perimeter of engagement. This is actually a screenshot of where I used to live in Boston. And the little window there was my apartment. And then you've got the street, the lawn, and this lot to the left. So when I got there, this just looked like any other street. We'll start with the lot on the left. That was an abandoned lot. And my neighbors and I would take our dogs there, but there was 3 tons of trash. We decided that if we cleaned it up, it can become a dog park. And it became a dog park. So instead of just thinking of my apartment as the place where I would clean up and keep orderly, I looked around and I decided something that might be possible. I pitched it to my neighbors and we took action, right? If you look at the lawn where there's not a lot of grass, There's not a lot of grass there because we do potlucks every Friday in the summer. Bring the grill out, people come home, have a beer, have a hot dog, hang out. Crime went down on our street when we started doing that because we displaced negative activity with positive activity. I decided that I can occupy that space and do things with my neighbors there. You look at the front of the sidewalk there. When it snowed, even though I had a parking lot in the back and I could park my car, I decided to extend the perimeter of my responsibility, the perimeter of engagement, and take it upon myself to shovel another spot for someone else. And so as we approach the rest of this afternoon, I'm challenging you to think about what is the perimeter of engagement for what your applications are. Does it extend beyond what you've already thought about? Could it be used in a different way? What is it that your community knows? So I'm challenging you as you go forward today, think about that perimeter and ask, can it be expanded? And that's where I'll close.
Thank you, Joseph. Wow. Okay. A lot of good information. I'd like to ask the three of you to come right up here. And I'm going to introduce Julie Clem from the National Cancer Institute, who's going to give us an introduction to what they're doing at NCI. And we will follow that up with a good discussion of getting some advice from the people who've just spoken. Julie?
Thank you very much. We're really pleased to be here today, and the timing is very good for us because we're sort of in the midst of a transition, and we've reached sort of a tipping point about how best to proceed. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and what I want to do to set up the conversation is just to talk briefly about the program we run in our organization, the National Cancer Informatics Program, to tell you why we're interested in open source and why we've tried to push a lot of our tools out into an open source community, and then kind of talk to you about some of the challenges in community building that we're thinking about, and then I hope to have a conversation about that. So the program we run is called the National Cancer Informatics Program, and it's a trans-NCI program aimed at fostering community to help address the informatics needs of the cancer research community. And through the program, we foster the community development. We try to provide access to well-described data collections. We focus on maintaining an interoperability infrastructure and standards to support interoperability. And then we also work to reinforce collaborative research partnerships. And we also are promoting the training needs to help next generation scientists use the informatics tools they need. So why is the National Cancer Institute interested in open source? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is that many of you may know that biology has become a very data-intensive science. There's been some game-changing technology that has evolved in the past 3 to 5 years that now allows a human genome to be sequenced for close to $1,000. And that completely changes how one thinks about disease, and especially cancer, which is a disease of the genome. And so the ability to manage and analyze this enormous data has become a significant issue in the cancer research community, and one that needs lots of minds thinking about it. Sustainability. So, of course, we've heard a number of times today about the realities of the federal government, and NIH and NCI is no exception. We need to do more with less. And we need to do a lot more because of this challenge of the data we're dealing with. And so we really need to look at how to sustain and extend our software tools to support the evolving needs. And finally, I think another important reason that we're interested in open source is this emerging open science movement. So there's a real grassroots of movement these days to make sure science is, the products of science, especially federally funded science, are freely available to everyone. So that means not only open source software, which we are talking a lot about here today, but open data and open access, so open publications. And so we think that making these research projects open is a community demand. And this is a longstanding commitment of the NIH and has just become, increasing in priority. So with that context, we've launched what we're calling the NCIP Open Development Initiative. And it's really, aimed at the goals here, and these are goals I think we've heard throughout the day today already. Supporting innovation, enabling crowdsourcing or the creation of better tools through crowdsourcing, empowering the community to take leadership of these projects. I say insulating from the ebbs and flows of the federal funding cycle, so put the software out there so it can be developed and expanded when the users need it, not just when we happen to have the budget for it. And finally, just engaging a broader community of talented developers toward what I think everyone agrees is an important public health problem, that of understanding and addressing the suffering due to cancer. So with that, around about before 2011, actually, we started thinking about how can our organization build a community of developers to work on the software tools that we had developed through government contracts. And this is actually a pretty large portfolio of tools. Our portfolio, there are over 50 tools representing broad domains of cancer research, including clinical and translational research, cancer biology and genomics, and infrastructure projects having to do with interoperability and semantics. And so as we started thinking about this problem, one of the first things we did in early 2011 is what the government does when they want to know what to do. We released an RFI, and the RFI, request for information, was aimed at the open source experts to say, okay, here's our problem. We have all of these tools. What should we do? And we got back a number of very thoughtful responses. And I'll talk about those in a minute. And we also just started doing our homework, just educating ourselves about what's going on in open source, what are the different models of governance, what are the tools people are using, and just starting to understand what we've all been talking about today, and licensing considerations and so forth. And so then based on the responses we got to our RFI, we held a think tank. So we invited the respondents to come to our offices, and we had kind of a one-day, very thoughtful meeting where we just talked about how should we get started. And it was a very, very useful meeting. And really some of the key take-homes for that meeting were get moving, do something. Don't just sit and keep thinking about it. Try some stuff. And in that context, the message we heard is lower the barriers, right? Don't make it hard to participate. And a couple of the barriers that we focused on were, one, the license. So, and the talks today have set this up very nicely. We were using a custom open source license. It was a very permissive license, but it was custom. And it was custom because the program started quite a while ago, before I think it was well understood that the OSI licenses were as popular and well understood. So one of the first decisions we made was to transition from our custom open source license to the BSD 3-clause license. And we worked with our legal counsel to make sure we could do that and how to go about it and so forth. And one thing I should emphasize again, that this is all contractor developed software. So the copyright holders are the contracting companies. And so we implemented the BSD. We're implementing the BSD license, but maintaining those copyright holders. And the second barrier we decided that we wanted to remove was access to the source code. So our code has always been open source, but it's been, the gated community, or the walled garden. It's been a walled garden. So the code has been sitting on government subversion servers. And if you know where to look, you could find it. Or if you knew who to talk to, you could find it. But it's not readily available. And how to contribute code back was not readily done. So our second decision was to move the code over to a publicly available repository, and we chose GitHub. And one of the reasons at the time, not only is it a very popular, as we've all heard today, place to put code, but government terms and conditions have been pre-negotiated. So getting the permission to do that had kind of been worked out ahead of time for us. So earlier this year, we began implementing these two changes. And we began the code and license migration. And as of this morning, our channel that we established, the NCIP GitHub channel, had 104 repositories representing about 45 projects. So one question I have is, when is a channel too big? Because we've got more to go. And this is just a schematic showing just some of the repositories where the colors indicate domains of software. So the purple, tissue banking; the red, cancer biology and genomics; the orange, clinical trial software, and so forth. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So we're almost done with this migration, and in some ways, I think it's been the easy part. It's been kind of march through these, look at the repositories, make some decisions about the migration and so forth. But intellectually, not too hard, and going quite well. So now what we want to talk about is, okay, it's out there, but we don't want to do the dump and run, right? How do we build communities around these projects? And one of the challenges as we think about this is the diversity of the projects we're talking about here. So I've talked to you about the numbers and the domains. So the domains are run the breadth of cancer research, again, from cancer biology clear to clinical trial software. So that's a diversity of communities. Clinicians are very different than basic researchers. So there's that level of diversity. There's also the diversity of the state of activity these projects are in. So there are some projects where we have had some community development, where someone was interested enough that they took they worked with us to get access to the code, to make changes and so forth. And those are, we see those as very nice low-hanging fruit or great opportunities for community engagements. And there are a few examples of those. But there are still many that are still just, they're being developed by government contracts still. Where the government, we are funding contract development for software that's strategically important for our community. And then there's actually quite a few projects that are just dormant. We funded the development many, many years ago, and to our knowledge, there's not much going on. But this is a taxpayer-funded resource, and I think it's a valuable code that we wanted to make available in case someone wanted to pick up that project and carry it forward. There's also a technology diversity. So we're talking about, among these projects, database applications, there are toolkits, there are data models, there's analytical scripts. So there's kind of a diversity of what types of technologies are there. And finally, a fourth dimension of diversity I'll mention is kind of what I'll call readiness to build open source community. So, some of the code is really messy. Some is nice and modular. There's a whole breadth. Most of the projects have pretty good or very good documentation. Some don't. So that's a consideration. And again, some have very nice and tidy repository structures. Others don't. So we have made some early steps at community building, and I just wanted to mention where we've started dipping our toe in the water, if you will, And so, for example, a project called CA LIMS, which is a cancer laboratory information management system, there was a lot of community interest in this project, but then the government no longer had budget to continue funding it. So we asked for community volunteers to start leading this project, and we got some volunteers who said, "Yeah, we'll do this." But and we kind of gave them the reins and we said, go for it. But then we haven't seen a lot of activity yet. So what do we do to support them? Another project called CA Tissue, which is a biorepository application developed by the government, still kind of governed by our organization, has had quite a bit of community interest in adaption, and we've actually hosted a couple of code jamborees to start educating the community about this tool. And I think we see this as a very a community that I think we're going to really focus on fostering. Another set of tools, XIP AVT, they're medical imaging tools, originally developed in an academic center. We funded them for a few years to develop some enhancement that were of broad community need, but now that engagement is over, it's now re-owned, if you will, by the academic community. And that's kind of a nice story because they had ownership and then continued ownership even after the government contracting ended. And they've recently held a hack fest to build their community. And finally, we have tools. This one's called ISATAB Nano, which is a data standard for exchanging nanoparticle characterization data, where we, the government, work jointly with some community members to develop the standard, and then we're working together to adapt some academically developed software tools to produce this data standard. And that's a case where we're taking community code and forking it into our channel, and that's so I think that's another avenue we're interested in. So with that kind of background, these are just some questions that I hope can kick off our discussion, such as, how do we approach community building for such a diverse portfolio of projects? We have to develop unique campaigns around each one. That's going to be hard to scale. How do we galvanize a diverse community to take on appropriate roles? What are appropriate roles? Is this an important consideration? For projects who we want to identify community leaders, how do we do this? How do we achieve a maximum effectiveness? Where do we put our energy? Is our codathons or hackfests or what have you the way to go? Or do we just tell people have at it? And importantly, how do we incentivize participation? So these are some of the questions I'd love to discuss today.
Wonderful. As with this morning, I'd like to start by giving the three of you an opportunity to ask Julie questions. And she just provided a lot of information, but there may be some additional probing questions so you feel like you understand where she's at. Just kind of get the lay of the land.
Yes, I have this rash that I've been...
Oh, and these are microphones, which are working.
So I shouldn't have said that thing earlier, is what you're saying?
But if we can pick them up. Sure. Because then the people at home can hear us too.
You guys have any questions? Right?
Sure. So I want to know, you said you had 50 different projects up there. One of the first questions I always ask is, what's most important to you in leadership right now? Like, where would you start based on what you know? Like, where do those priorities lay? And because you can't do everything at once, right? So if you can fill us in on that, that'd be helpful.
Well, I think what we've started doing is looking at projects where we have seen some community interest already, and I mentioned the CA Tissue project. And so that's a project where we've been funding development for a number of years now, and I think the project's achieved a level of maturity and a level of community interest that seems like a logical place to put our effort. And I think other projects like that where we've seen some community interest already, and we would like, we don't want to hold back the pace of innovation, I think is, where we would see, prioritizing our efforts on community building. Yeah.
Just to establish a baseline, could you just walk through a very high level of what the normal life cycle for a project might look like? We have a problem, we have a contractor, we build software, it gets open sourced, we reach out to the community. Just a very high level what those steps kind of look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of models. So there are cases where there's a brand new need, right? And so we would, as the government, embark on sort of a high-level needs assessment and requirements gathering, and then let out a contract for design and development, and then then the operations and maintenance, kind of depending on the life cycle of that need, and then the software is retired, when that need has, is sufficiently, low or what have you. There are also cases where there's a tool that's been developed, say, by an academic community, and we see would meet a broader need if there was some, quote, tool hardening that was done to make it more usable by a broader community, and that's another mechanism we've used.
So what is the scope of your community, or the communities that you're supporting right now? Are they individuals, educational institutions, industry? What's that look like?
It's mostly academic centers, so mostly cancer centers across the country that are academic centers. So I would say academic institutions are our primary customers.
Earlier you said, with the project, the tissue project, you said there was some interest. Can you define what that interest looks like, and then also take that a step further and say how you're measuring success on that particular project?
Sure. So I think the need for applications to manage biorepositories is a pretty widespread need across the community, and has been one where there hasn't been an open source software solution out there. So this tool nicely filled a need in the community. But each biorepository center may have a slightly different workflow for managing their biospecimens or distributing those biospecimens. So while that basic need is shared across the community, the specifics of the workflows can be different, and then there's a need for customization for a given workflow. And that's, I think, where we've seen community members say, this is a good framework for us, but we need it to be changed in this way. And that's where the interest has come in to make changes. And what's happened, I think, to date is that those changes have been made locally, and then they've stayed locally with that institution. But I think in some of these cases, the changes are needs that could be shared by others in the community, and we'd like to be building that mechanism to bring those adaptations back in to the central code, if you will.
Thanks.
Then suggest a way.
One thing that struck me, I've always said that you should treat an open source project like a political campaign, right? So when President Obama ran, his campaign slogan wasn't "Yes, we did." It was "Yes, we can." It was painting a picture of where we could be, the better world that could exist, the problems that are, and then engaging others to come and create communities around shared problems to create shared solutions. Oftentimes in software development, especially government software development, we do the opposite. We say, there's a problem. We went out and spent a lot of money on a contractor. We got an amazing solution. Here, please contribute, right? And so first off, you're making me awkward as a developer. I'm not saying you personally. I'm saying in the software community. You guys are doing a great job. You're making me feel awkward as a developer because you're saying, you just paid my colleague a bunch of money to do this, and now you're asking me to do it for free. And so one thing that the biggest piece of low-hanging fruit that I always find is I'm from Chicago originally, and the slogan there is vote early, vote often. And so in open source, push early, push often, right? So from day 1, day 2, day 5, as early as you possibly can, that you have something tangible. Put the project out there so that the code's public. Get people engaged and invested in the problem rather than solution, and say, hey, this is where we want to go. We know that other people have that same problem. Outline things like project roadmaps, issues, milestones. Tell me where you want it to go. Paint that vision and ask for my help in getting to that vision rather than saying, hey, this is what we did. And you guys are doing a great job at doing that.
So in that context, would bringing the community together in person on some of these projects and with some defined questions, is that an approach that we should be thinking about? Hackathons where, okay, here, we've heard these 3 problems, let's come together and solve them.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a great point. I mean, I'll go to one of the mobile apps that we published where there was a lot of criticism because it didn't meet particular groups or individuals' specific needs. It was sort of halfway there for this person, a third of the way or 2/3 of the way. at that time, it was a completely closed source effort. So we missed an opportunity there. Looking back, and you know, this may be an opportunity for us as well to engage with hackathons, et cetera, reach out to the community. This may be something that you can do as well. You know, look back at that criticism, that those needs that were expressed by the community, the people, the users. Okay, without the users, we're just creating bits, and try to solve that problem.
So, sort of 2 points here. One would be, I heard you say something earlier around, you got some feedback from the community and they told you, something else would be helpful. I think as you go forward, there should be I think you were touching base on this, but there's a process that happens, and the process needs to be repeated across your communities as you learn. So it's like a community learning management system. How are you documenting the lessons that you're learning, and how are the staff who are responsible for facilitating this learning together and sharing together, so you create more knowledge and you're reducing kind of the liability of losing that knowledge as you go, because people move on and change and get assigned or whatever that is. So that's one thing that's really important, and it sounds like you've had success there, which is great. And then in terms of what we're talking about in general, one thing I always remind people is we're dealing with people here. We're dealing with people using technology, so we're human beings having a human experience through technology, so we always have to acknowledge what our strengths and our weaknesses are, and so that always needs to be managed and facilitated and designed around so that people can have a successful experience.
Yeah, that brings up a great point of thinking through the user experience of being a developer or being a member of the community. So one thing, so for those of you who don't know, GitHub is run as an open source project internally, right? So you need people just come and jump right in and out of projects very frequently. So we spend a lot of time focusing on friction, meaning how long does it take from me saying I want to contribute to actually contributing that first pull request or actually contributing that first issue. And so what you mentioned makes a lot of sense, is thinking of systems and thinking of policies that you can replicate across repositories. Every README should have these 5 things. It should have how to contribute, licensing, whatever it might be, roadmap, what those things are, but then think about the entire stack from the title, the name of the repository. So CA LIMS, if I'm just an average developer, yes, I'm not as knowledgeable about the cancer laboratory information management system. Did I get that right? Oh, so good. I might not know that, but the needs for that project might be similar to somebody who's doing A/B testing on a website, right? So if it's just laboratory information system actually spelled out rather than the abbreviation, that's already reducing the cognitive burden that I need to start participating. And the last thing on that is from a technical standpoint. So every project's going to have different requirements, different bootstrapping needs, different software. I know that I can go into any GitHub project internally and type the commands script bootstrap, and it'll install everything I need. And I don't have to worry about installing 15 different dependencies and then compiling this from C. And then the same thing with script server or script build, script run. And so just have common technological solutions across the board to minimize, I'm a developer, I want to contribute to that lag time before my first pull request, my first bit is actually committed.
Toward the end of my presentation, I mentioned the mobile code catalog. That's something I've been working on with the folks over at the Digital Services Innovation Center at GSA. And one of the things that we did as we were building this, as we're piecing everything together, is we went out to the community, if you will, the people that are working on mobile projects, and asked them 2 questions. Not only what would you need, which is the obvious question, but also what do you have that you could contribute? Do you have mobile apps that you'd be willing to open source? Do you have modular code that others might find useful? And it's not just, we've been talking about solving a particular, solving the community's problem, but also I think it can be very effective going to the community and asking them what do they think they could do to help.
That's a great point, and going forward, I think in terms of building this larger community, not just the communities around the tools, but this cancer informatics community, is offering them, hey, put your code here in our channel as a way to you have things you can bring to share with others. And so I think, is that something, does that seem like an approach where we invite people to put their code on our channel, or is that just, get to be too many things in one place? Could that help people, draw them to the site and feel a sense of community?
Or you could even be talking about specific repositories. You may even focusing on one of the 140, saying like, this is what it does. How do you envision this working better, more efficiently, producing better results, etc. Even if they don't know how to code, getting those ideas to get a process moving forward, in a direction that supports the community's needs, I think is that spark that you can seek.
I would echo that. What I was going to say is there's a couple really important questions to ask. How's this working out for you, right? What should we do next? What do you recommend? And almost all the examples I showed, it was somebody else's idea. I was just the one willing to take the action and bring other people to it, right? So I know I don't have to have the answer. I just got to keep asking questions.
And you brought up a good point that sparked. So one of the first things that I do when I open source a project, and personally, is I create a how to contribute file or put a how to contribute section in the README. And you should take a 50-state solution approach to that section. It shouldn't just be, if you're a developer, fork the project, submit a pull request. It should be, if you're a researcher, look at the documentation, look at the roadmap, tell us what should be in the roadmap. If you're a soccer mom and you use the software, open up an issue. Whatever that demographic might be, from developer to user to maybe if you're you're someplace in between a user and developer, help improve the documentation. But wherever I am in kind of this contribution spectrum, give me an option if I want to contribute. That it's a very low. It's a scary experience, right? It's the government. They're like tracking me and stuff. I don't know. Like, will I get on a list if I contribute a pull request? So help me hold my hand through that process, regardless of where I am and what type of community member I am.
That's a great point. Remember, the community is not just software developers, but the users and so forth.
And a great example of that is the open data policy that was published just last month. As developers, we can fork that site, make changes, and submit a pull request, but that's not the only way to contribute back. They give you tools to edit the content or submit edits to that content right there within your browser. So, like you're saying, it's not just about engaging the developers, but actually getting the subject matter experts engaged.
One thing that I do when I'm on particularly a new project or coming into like the example of our border, is I started paying attention. Who are the folks that were giving thoughtful responses? And then I made a list, and it turned out there was like 20 of them. And I emailed them, and I said, hey, I'm the community manager. I would just love to really appreciate a couple minutes of your time just to get your thoughts and see if there's something I can do to help you out. And those folks had already self-selected, so and I knew they were already committed by their thoughtful responses. And what I actually did with those folks, and the idea for this, the story I shared was actually theirs. A lot of it just happened on the phone. And so when someone invests, I invest back because I don't have that much time. So I prioritize where I have to do, and you always have to think, who cares about this? Who's funding this? What do they need now? That's a reality. But then I make it really easy for anyone to contribute. And then the folks who have proven over time, and they have this engagement funnel, I didn't get to show it, but as you get further towards the edge, you want as many people coming in. So when you get to the edge and there's the last phase is leadership, you have a really strong base of leadership. You need to keep bringing people in. And you need to keep requalifying. And sometimes just investing back, you ask, how do I incentivize? If people are investing that much, there's something already there for them. It's just a matter of being there with them while they're excited and saying thank you and acknowledging them for the contributions they make. Saying thank you is probably one of the cheapest but most powerful things you can do in a community.
I just want to say, it seems to me that there's a lot of really excellent advice that can be applied to almost any situation here. And so to try to bring it down a little bit more, as I think about how to apply this in your situation, the big piece that I think I'm missing is what your community looks like today. I mean, if you got, was it 104 releases with 45 different projects, is that really 10 different communities? Is that 100 different communities? And obviously each one's going to be in a different situation, but can you put them all under one tent? Or, I mean, kind of what does all that look like?
Yeah, I think you've really framed what our biggest challenge is that I'm not sure you can put them all under one tent because these are very diverse communities. Again, we're talking, we have some basic research tools, and we clear to clinical trials tools, and we have, tools for doing, semantics and so forth. So it's a pretty broad range of tools out there, and so, one question we have is, given the breadth, and given that there are some niche communities of interest, one thing we've wondered is how to develop community leaders, and we've had some success, initial success, but it seems like maybe a little more support is needed because people say, yeah, I'm interested in that, but I don't know how to do it, and how do we mentor or support a new community lead or on a project, and I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, can you just go into a little bit more depth about the relationship between contractors, government employees, and the community, just how they interact on a daily basis? In the context of that question, obviously it's much bigger. But.
Well, so some of these projects we are no longer funding the development of. So this is, call it a quote, completed project, and the code is
no
in
such
GitHub.
Thing. No such thing.
Right. But we're, in that sense, the government is no longer putting money into it, but it's a tool that's, in use. Right, and so the community is wondering, so how is this going to get supported? And having some sort of leadership there is going to be necessary. And how do we mentor up a community lead in that regard? And so, to answer your question, in a situation like that, we in NCIP we want to foster the community development to support them. There's not really a contractor relationship there necessarily.
So it sounds like, at least in some of these, there is a pre-existing community. How are they tied together? I mean, is it an email list? Is it what is the tangible thing that connects you to those people?
Right. So I think in some cases there are email lists, and I think we heard this morning the importance of establishing email lists, and maybe that's one suggestion then, is for these projects, making sure there is a clear mechanism for communication, because in some cases, it may be ad hoc, let's say, and so making sure that the communication channel for the project is clear, and that when you go to that project, say on GitHub, here's how I communicate with the community.
For any of these, are there state departments of health or nonprofits that have a vested interest in any of these where they can take leadership? I mean, you guys can only do so much, especially with this many projects. Are there any that you can legally, transfer, maybe not responsibility, ownership, but at least responsibility for managing it, any of these?
So, yes, I think so. Yeah, and that's what we're trying to look to do, is to transition ownership to other communities who have an interest in the project and who might be willing to take up leadership.
I'm going to touch on the email list side of things. Working for GovDelivery, I have some really interesting data I can share with you on. If you're looking to grow your no. If you're looking to grow a larger audience of developers, and I think I saw that was one of your questions. So if you, and I know the NIH actually uses GovDelivery, so if you created like a landing page on your website for those developers and coded it, did all the SEO right, and you made it really easy for people to sign up for like email updates about like if the code changes or whatever, your list could grow. And if you were to put an overlay on that landing page, we see our clients get an uptick of 250 to 550% growth in new email subscribers. So if we look at that funnel and you're trying to pump more people into it, so your code changes, we can actually watch that and then kick it out to like your general audience for you automatically. I can have someone follow up and see if that's something that you guys want to do. Just use it. You have it already. But that would grow a larger kind of audience for you, and then you can use that to send like very thoughtful, tactical messages out to folks to continue to engage them. The one thing I'll say that I like to remind folks is we're having a different experience here today in person, because I can actually look at you, I can see you smiling, I can see you thinking, and all those sorts of things. Never discount that. like technology, in my opinion, is what we have to use because we can't be in the same place at the same time all the time to get our job done, right? So oftentimes I see that being forgotten. And then the beginning question, can you restate what you had like a question or two ago? I wanted to take a stab at that, but we lost it. It was important. Do you remember what that was? Does anybody remember? We can skip it.
I mean, mentoring.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
the mentoring part. So Bennett said something around, giving people like meaningful actions. If I'm a researcher, I'm a soccer mom, or whatever it is, you can also create a community of community managers, mentors, and leaders. So, for example, what we're doing with the FEMA community is they're now starting to be more and more folks. So we have an internal group for just folks that are doing that, and we provide one-on-one intensive support to anyone who asks. And then you can ask your mentors to be mentor new mentors. So they're just different roles and ways people contribute based on their interests, their availability, and what it is that you're asking.
I really like that idea, that building a community of community leaders so that they can work with each other to brainstorm approaches.
And it's like going back to the political campaign, right? You gotta reach your influencers and your connectors and all those folks, and invest heavily there, because you can do that efficiently, because you can anticipate a higher return, but give them the tools to get everybody else. So that's part of that kind of community learning management system that you would want to incorporate in that. And then the other thing I would add too is, let's just forget, people kind of stink at getting stuff done most of the time. It's hard. So there might be in that README like some suggestions on like, only take on one thing at a time, be successful at. That's great. So reset the expectations and provide that sort of support. So one of the things you'll see on community.fema.gov is we're asking people to do all these community meetings. They're like, how do you do that? I have no idea. And like literally, we're going to break it down. Like, here's how to start a meeting. Like, you need to have flyers. You need to have an agenda. You need to have a time cop, a tangent cop, like all those things that people generally aren't that great at to have better experiences. So you have to build out the infrastructure and support the folks that'll do the work on your behalf.
I would say one of the biggest challenges I see for a government closed source project that becomes an open source project, or that the code then becomes published, and that I think is single-handedly the fastest way to sync an open source project, if there's anything you take away, is creating two different tiers of contributors, right? That there's this information imbalance, because you'll have a meeting about a feature that you want, and it'll be between you and your contractor physically in a building. Those notes are never memorialized. Those notes never appeared anywhere. Bug requests go back and forth through email. Maybe you have an Excel spreadsheet that's your bug tracker, or maybe you have some sort of internal bug tracker. So if you're talking about empowering outside developers, if I don't have that information you do, I feel like I'm being treated like the kid that, because you can't have candy tonight because I say so, right? So as much as possible, use the same mechanism for internal communication that you use for external communication, so that by definition then your external contributors and your internal contributors have the same level of information and then can start contributing. And the other half of that then is in terms of onboarding and in turn getting people up to speed. I don't need to reach out to you individually and be told, here's the history of the project, because it's all captured someplace publicly. It's not happening behind closed doors, and so I can just go and I can see, oh, this is why they made that decision, this was what they were trying to do, and I can then pick up where you left off without ever having to ask you for permission. So it's taking the blocks out of the system, the locks out of the system, and making sure it's electronic and as available as possible between the two tiers. So it sounds like in most agencies that happens on a repository by repository level, where like an individual feature, an individual bug, but specifically here it sounds like that might be a little bit more of a meta level, right? So is there the proper transparency that this project is sunset, this project is no longer being funded, this project we'd love to, when we're like, we have no use for this, we're never going to touch this ever again, this is cobweb code? Or is it that we just don't have the funding right now, maybe next budget cycle we'll have funding, we want to pick this back up, so please spend some time here. So all those kind of internal communications on the meta level might apply more here, just so that I, as an external developer, know where I should spend my time and if it's worth spending my time.
Start creating trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole point about being very transparent about the stage of activity of projects, I think is a great point that we should think about, because they really are at a broad stage of activity, and to the extent that we can communicate that to the community so they have some sense of where they should spend their time.
And to extend that even further, and we were talking about trust, trust the developers in the public trusting the process. There's also the other aspect too of the project owners, those in the agency, trusting that process as well, because By putting everything out in the open, which is great, which is really what we ought to do, we're also showing the public how the sausage is made. And those bugs, everybody can see that there's a bug, that there are many bugs maybe. And some project managers don't want the public to see that. But the challenge, though, is to sell them on the benefits of, okay, yes, the world's going to see that there are 50 bugs in this application, but guess what? We've got all these people who are capable or even willing to contribute back and to squash those bugs.
There's, I think, a lot of really good advice here. What I hear that sort of cuts across all of it is that you need sort of a system for managing a community that you can duplicate 50 times.
Or 104.
Or 104, whatever the actual number is. But within that, you referenced low-hanging fruit. I mean, there will be communities that you focus on and that you use to sort of perfect the system, right? And then you apply that across the others. But I think all of these ideas need to be applied sort of in different ratios to each of those communities.
I think there's some, what I'm hearing are some things we can do, as you say, across all of them in terms of transparency and being very clear about the state of the project. But then there are going to be some that are just going to be, more amenable to community building today. And if we can be successful there, then, hopefully that success, we can then move on to other projects and apply some of those lessons to some of these other projects.
Just I'm going to quickly touch on culture. So one of the things that that I've had a lot of success with is creating, like, you have your community charter statement, like, why are we here, what are we going to do, right? And then you have kind of your moderation policy, and it's what we're not going to do and how we're going to address that if it happens. And then you have, like, your community culture statement, and that is, I think of it in terms of, like, what I call it, it's like values, beliefs, rituals, and traditions, and I just lay it out. We comment on this, and we challenge that, and we do these things, and it kind of creates a real sense. And in every new community, I post it out. I'm like, here's what we've come up with. Help write this. Does this resonate with you? Does it not? Are we missing something? Something offensive? Let us know. And it's always a permission-based kind of approach. And so I wanted to tie that into, like, you're asking really great questions today, and it sounds like you're making a lot of really awesome progress here, which is inspiring. So thanks for sharing that story. But it comes back to, like, trusting your community too. Like, you're being very open here and asking great questions, but I think in terms of building trust, take some of the questions you've asked today and some of the input you've got. Like, I asked this question, we got this input. What do you guys think? Like, how would you're the users of this, validate this, or tear it apart for me?
Julie, if you have a question that you want to make sure gets answered, I think let's, if you want to ask that now, and then we'll go around, and then we can do a final round of sort of closing remarks.
I think one question and I think we've touched on it a lot, but is, that we've been thinking a lot about is how to support those community leaders and how much, right? And how do you know when, this, maybe we need to mentor up some other group, this isn't moving forward. And I think the idea of building a community of leaders so that they support each other is excellent, and I think that's something we should really think about. But other additional thoughts on that of how do we support the community to support itself, I think is something we'd really like to be thinking carefully about and getting input on.
Yeah, open source, and especially the reason open source works, and especially distributed open source, is because authority is decentralized. And so, as much as possible, if a pull request comes in, or a comment or whatever the platform, if something comes in and it has to go up the traditional government flagpole, and, like, the president needs to sign off on the pull request, it's going to sit there for a week, and that kills momentum. So, as much as possible, delegate to whoever the day-to-day shepherds of the project are, and then also as much as possible within the project, if it's a typo, if it's just get that going, say thank you, and create a momentum and a velocity by as much as possible embracing the fact it's very hard for government to do. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance there because you have your org chart and then just like a blob underneath your org chart that is the open source project. But as much as possible, try to push to the edge so that things can happen at the pace that the internet likes this thing to happen at.
Great advice, yeah.
I mean, they all say that necessity is the mother of invention. The same goes with the community building. I mean, people invent something because they have a vested interest in the solution. In terms of getting community leaders, find those with the vested interest. They will not just take it and run with it, they'll own it, which is, I mean, when you're talking those numbers, that's what you need.
Awesome point. And so I think when folks think about community management, they think of it as like tactics and things that happen, but it's actually people that make those tactics and things that happen. So for, like this FEMA project, I have, there are 3 of us that manage that community almost full time. So it's a ton of work. And in some scenarios, like GovLoop.com has 13 full-time employees that manage GovLoop. Nobody knows that there's that much effort behind it, but there is. So if your organization, it's important to make sure those resources are allocated, and oftentimes those resources you have and you're not even aware of them. So who are the program folks that have a vested interest in this that haven't yet connected the dots? And that's some of the work that you can do to kind of manage that and then connect those folks to the leaders and provide support, because often they're looking to make those kinds of relationships.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Then let's start with Mike. Any sort of broad, big picture, final closing thoughts you have?
I guess the only thing I would say is building on our experience. Be willing to let go as much as you can. Don't be those seagulls and Finding Nemo or just mine. You can't. It's not going to succeed like that. You're not going to get the contributions from the public that you'd want or need for the project to grow.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that this panel was talking about taking closed source projects and making them open. And I would kind of think of that the other way. Why we always think of it as why are we making this open source? Think of it in terms of why would we make this closed source? What's secretive about this? And your story is a great story to emphasize this, because it used to be that sharing was hard, right? You'd have an FTP server, an SVN server, have to email and patch, and it was just the mechanics were really hard. But technology is pushing us to a tipping point where it's easier to work together than it is to work alone. And so you can take those tools, and it's no longer that it's if you wanted to do a closed source, you have to build more stuff, and it ends up being more expensive in the long run. I think your story really emphasizes that well, that as technology advances, that so too does it give us the tools to build communities around problems, and we can ask why should this be secret rather than why should this be open.
I think if you think about the definition of leadership, it's really about helping other leaders kind of grow and do the things they're supposed to do. So trust the community and focus on developing leaders, I guess is all I have to say.
That's great advice. I think when we had our think tank a year ago, we had kind of a running joke through the meeting that we're kicking the teenagers out of the basement, or the college students who came home, and wanted to live in the basement. We need to kick them out, even though maybe they're not quite ready. And so I think that letting go, right, and letting mistakes happen, but knowing that that's going to happen along the way to lead to sort of ownership or self-governing projects. No, I think that's it. I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to talking more in the breakouts.
Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists.